Welcome to the second video in which I'm going to read you another part of the forthcoming book on Christ's resurrection in early Christianity. This time I'd like to introduce you into the Jewish beginnings, because any attempt to understand the beginnings of early Christianity has to overcome the entrenched assumption of the Jesus movement being a new religion based on a new gospel or a new testament, as being a new Israel and so forth, a picture that, as we will see, and if you read the monograph, was created only towards the mid-2nd century by the teacher of newness, of a new religion, Marcion of Sinope. This Christian teacher who, as we will see, was so crucial for the history of early Christianity and the discovery, or can we say rediscovery, of Christ's resurrection in the mid-2nd century. But Christianity was not born into Judaism, but from its infancy was simply Jewish, part of the variety that we mean by Judaism. This outset had its bearing on the significance of Christ's resurrection and the contents of Easter and Sunday. Moreover, in the first centuries, what we call Judaism was made up of diverse regional and conceptual traditions in Palestine, Israel and beyond, shaped by Greek cities and Roman powers with centers in Alexandria, Antioch, Rome and elsewhere. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes and Samaritans met in a multitude of synagogue communities of like-minded members, people from a whole host of such backgrounds of similar and also different social, cultural and geographical milieu. Rabbinic Judaism, with its Aramaic orientation, did not dominate Judaism before the 4th and 5th centuries of our era, and was already the product of the mutual part segregation of Judaism and Christianity in a then Christianized and Hellenized Roman Empire. And even then, Judaism had tried with only limited success to shake off its Greek traditions and promoted an Aramaic-based counter-Byzantine religion against the background of a Greek and Roman institutionalized Christianity which had lost some, but not all, of its Hebrew and Aramaic Jewish traditions. If we look back to the beginnings of Christianity, what we read is Jewish history, part of Jewish history. Neither Paul nor any member of his communities knew that there were Christians, or that they would later be called even the first Christians. The growing and often painful split was neither the first nor the last in Judaism, and it was never complete. Centuries before, the Hebrew tradition had already suffered divisions. Samaritans and Jews shared their past, their Torah, and their concept of worshipping God on a mountain, but they had developed different and competing cult centers, located in geographically separated territories. Mount Gerizim in Samaria close to Sebaste, and Mount Zion in Judea in the north of the old city of Jerusalem. The growing split between Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity did not develop into a neat geographical divide. Rather, after 70 AD, the post-war situation of the lost battle against the Romans, when Jews were banned from Jerusalem and scattered over the already existing empire-wide diaspora, meant that Jews and Jewish Christians had to live side by side as minorities in Greco-Roman environments. While the Samaritans shared with Jews much of the Torah, the authority of further Jewish literature was part of an inner Jewish debate and one of the grounds for the various strands in Judaism. Sadducees, to some extent like the Samaritans, solely accepted the Torah. The Pharisees, however, added the prophets and scriptures, and as part of the latter produced further writings. A major step in the formation and canonization of the Pharisaic Jewish scriptures was the translation of the Hebrew Tanakh, Torah, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the books of Moses, of the prophets and scriptures. A translation into Greek with the production of the so-called Septuagint, undertaken, as we think, in Alexandria of Egypt in the years before 132 BC. But still after the translation, the Hebrew Tanakh was not yet quite rigidly closed. Its third division was still in a somewhat fluid condition, and there were in circulation numerous sacred writings in Greek, of which a considerable number became gradually and quite naturally attached to the authoritative collection. It would have been in no sense surprising, nor would it have been regarded as extraordinary if from the Christian side some new edifying books had been added to this collection. Judaism in the 2 centuries before and in the early years of our era was both Greek and Aramaic speaking, and many if not all Christian writings of the first 100 years were part of this Jewish literature production, although the divide between the Greek and the Aramaic Jewish traditions was certainly widening. The Aramaic literature that supposedly record the teachings of the rabbinic sages who lived in Palestine from the 1st to the early 3rd centuries AD, the so-called Tannaitic literature, includes a wide range. Just take the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Baraitot of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds, the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael on Exodus, the Sipra on Leviticus, and the Sipra on Numbers and Deuteronomy. Yet, these rabbinic writings were the product of only one particular religious party or movement within Judaism. But there were other forms of Judaism. For example, that of diaspora, before the Palestinian rabbinate was to stamp its authority comprehensively on many diaspora communities. And there were also popular Judaism. Many of the writings, unfortunately lost today, grew out of schools of Pharisees, rabbis, local schoolmasters and philosophical teachers. Rabbinic and Christian literature that started to replace the most loved oral tradition of earlier centuries only gradually substituted what was called the living voice. Still in the 2nd century, Bishop Papias of Hierapolis, who himself wrote books, regarded the living voice as more reliable than any written testimony, while well into the 2nd century written literature only made its way to limited geographical locations by special groups. Christianity grew within and only slowly out of Judaism. Of course, with Paul and his missionary activity, and even potentially earlier, with the expulsion of the first followers of Jesus from Jerusalem, missionary activities amongst non-Jews had begun. But as we know from Matthew and Acts, this venture was not undisputed amongst the followers of Jesus. Moving beyond Palestinian, Pharisaic Jewish strongholds into Samaria was not easily accepted. So old was the conflict between Jews and Samaritans. Nevertheless, Paul is an example who crosses borders. He was educated in a Pharisaic rabbinic tradition, but his views are in many ways close to the teachings which we find connected with Stephen, the first martyr, Philip, and the other so-called Hellenists of Acts 6, which, as we will see, have a lot in common with Samaritan thinking. In the first years, the early church was mainly concerned with business common to their broader Jewish community, to interpret the law, to settle legal issues of circumcision, food, communion, and ethics. And from the early days, the tension was there between limiting the gospel to the confines of the Jewish law, or letting it move outside the Jewish community to the so-called God-fearers, the Samaritans, or even Gentiles. One main topic carried powder into the synagogue. It was not the resurrection, but it touched upon it, as it had to do with interpreting the Jewish law. The big question was whether or not new male members who underwent baptism would not need to be circumcised. Baptism became seen as the sign of God's covenant amongst those who followed Jesus. Paul had a pronounced position and radical reading of the law. His active approach to convert non-Jews led the young movement to its first tests, which brought it close to breaking up. The resurrection served Paul to underline the saving character of baptism, a topic still firmly embedded in its Jewish frame within which the broader Christian community began to flourish. Then, the resurrection secured Paul his own authority, independent from anybody. For Paul, not only did his authority depend on him having experienced the revelation of the risen Christ, as he had never met Jesus of Nazareth, but he had also gained through his encounter his dramatically life-changing turn from a zealous Pharisee who persecuted Jewish followers to an energetic supporter of this movement. Paul had put pressure on the young Jesus community by extending it beyond the confines of Judaism. For some decades, however, a significant number of members still observed Jewish law. Galilee, the Jewish diaspora in the north of Palestine with powerful Greco-Roman imperial cities like Tiberias, but also Greek-influenced towns like Nazareth, provided the homeland for Jesus and his first fellows. The young Jesus movement encompassed people from all strands of Jewish life, in Jerusalem and Judea, but also Samaritans who had come into contact with Jesus, who had heard of him, somehow had approached him and used his name. They had all shouldered the Hellenistic cultural baggage. How did people of such varied backgrounds react to the fatal cross scenario? Naturally, each tried to understand it through the lens of their own religion and culture, which produced a multiple picture of little precision how to understand and how to cope with Jesus' death on the cross. In the next video, I'd like to introduce you into some views amongst Jews, how they did cope and could cope with Jesus' death on the cross.